are missing a projector, so we did locate a monitor here. Hopefully you can see my slides with the monitor. And first of all, thank you all for coming this evening. This is a public hearing that is being conducted in accordance with Utah Code for groups who want to put an initiative petition on the ballot. And it has to happen in 7 different regions across the country, across the state. And this is one of the regions that it's happening in 6 other locations this evening at the same time. And there was one this afternoon in Vernal, Utah that was done, I believe, 11 o'clock this morning. And other than that, we're welcome you here. We'll go through an agenda here briefly in just a minute. But before we do that, I'm going to bring up our agenda for tonight. By the way, that's a tagline, protecting our Utah's neighborhood elections. Here's the agenda. So I have asked Chris Booth to give us a prayer.
Father in heaven, thank you for this day. We're grateful for how many blessings, especially the blessings of freedom. And we're grateful for the price that has been paid for that freedom by men and women who've gone before us, and men and women who are now serving around the world in our armed forces. We pray for them, Father. We pray that thou will bless them and protect them and bring them home safely to their families. We are grateful for the opportunity to meet here tonight and are thankful for the freedom to do so, and pray for thy Spirit to be with us, that we will learn the things that we need to learn about Keep My Voice and about this initiative to help keep our caucus system strong in Utah. We are grateful again for all we've been blessed with, and pray for these things in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen.
Amen. Claire, could I ask you to lead us in the pledge? I'm going to bring up the flag here on the screen so everybody can do that for us.
Please stand for the pledge.
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you. The balance of the agenda, ladies and gentlemen, this is a public hearing. Anyone can make a comment or ask questions. I would ask you to hold your comments and questions until I'm done with my presentation, at which point we'll open it up for any questions you may have about the initiative and about the competing initiative, which is also being circulated out there. People are gathering signatures for another initiative called Count My Vote. This is the second time around that group has done their initiative petition. They did their first one in 2014. And the rules for the comments and questions will be, you're limited to 2 minutes each. Please be respectful and civil in your comments, and people who are disruptive will ask you to leave if you're disruptive. So again, thank you. I'll go ahead with my thoughts at this point. Realizing they're really, for me, this is sort of a passionate issue. Because quite frankly, in my opinion, what the state of Utah has done is they have usurped a constitutional right of political parties to nominate their candidates in their own methods, whatever methods they choose, which in their view will put forward candidates on the public ballot that will best represent their platform of their party. And so I may seem a little passionate tonight, and if I get too passionate, please let me know and I'll try and tone it down a little bit. But thank you for coming, and let's just go ahead with my presentation at this point. Let me just talk to you about the history of caucus meetings and neighborhood elections in the United States and in Utah. I don't know if you know this, ladies and gentlemen, but in the Revolutionary period, prior to the Declaration of Independence, the founders of our nation, who were British citizens, they organized their society in essentially what were 100-unit families, and they called them caucuses. The original name came from the early 1700s. Sam Adams' father actually was what they called a ship caulker. He would caulk the ships as they would and make them waterproof. the wood ships that they had back in those days. And then they would gather, these guys that were doing this caulking, if you will, around these ships, they would gather, and they became known eventually as caucus, transferred into caucus meetings, which essentially became, in the Revolutionary period, became known as committees of safety and committees of correspondence. Each community started having these kinds of things, and they had a, quote, shadow government that happened outside of the British government. And the British loyals, they were really kind of upset, actually, that the founders were able to organize in that way. In Utah history, it's kind of interesting, but let me just, before we go into that, let me just suggest to you that Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, the second president of the United States, unfortunately, he felt like in the latter years of his life that we had simply lost liberty. Now that might be a surprise to most of you in this audience, because he was fully convinced that freedom in America was fatally wounded at about the time of his death, which was in the 1820s. By 1820 or so, he maintained that he and his fellow founders had blown their opportunity and that American freedom had slipped away. And he wasn't one to just complain about something and not do anything about it. This may seem a little bit inconceivable to many Americans today. Thomas Jefferson felt like in the 1820s that they had blown it, that they didn't give America freedom and liberty. And to back that up, let me just give you some statements from some letters that Thomas Jefferson wrote in his later years. This one came in 1822. I regret that I am now to die in the belief that useless sacrifice of the generation of 1776 to acquire self-government and happiness to their country is to be thrown away by this unwise and unworthy passions of their sons. Now, why would Thomas Jefferson write that in letters to his friends in 1822? Because he really thought that they had lost it, they had blown it. And why? Because our government is now taking so steady a course as to show by what road it will pass to destruction. That is, by consolidation at first and then corruption, its necessary consequence after it's consolidated into where the national government, I see the deepest affliction and rapid strides with which the federal branch of our government is advancing towards usurpation of all rights reserved to the states. And that this consolidation of itself and all powers, in foreign and domestic, and that too, by construction, which is the courts, and if legitimate, it leaves no limits to the power of the national government. That was a big concern of Thomas Jefferson in 1825. That our national government was usurping all power that it had no business doing, that was not delineated in Article 1, Section 8. What do you think he would do today, ladies and gentlemen, if he was aware of what our federal government is doing today? I think he would kind of be in shock, even more than he is now. So, let me just suggest to you that while Jefferson was fully convinced that his friends had blown it, and that their opportunity was, that he wasn't one to simply just give up. So, in typical fashion, he put together a plan to recreate the Republic. You can find this plan in letters to his friends and proposals that he had presented to the Virginia legislature in the state of Virginia, because Thomas Jefferson was a Virginian. And he wanted to see this implemented in the state of Virginia. He called it Jefferson's Plan of 100 Families, and more commonly known as the Ward Plan. He has two great, this is a quote from a letter again, he says, I have two great measures of heart with which no republic can maintain its strength. That of the general education, to enable every man to judge for himself what will secure or endanger his freedom, and then to divide every county into hundreds, families of 100s, groups of 100 families, if you will, of such a size that all the children of each will be within reach of a central school in it. Every 100, besides a school, should have a justice of the peace, and a constable, and a captain of its militia. These officers, and some others within the 100, should be a corporation to manage its concerns and take care of its roads, and its poor, and its police, and its patrols. So Thomas Jefferson was of the opinion that these groups of 100 should really be where most government takes place, at the local level. And you see, one of the reasons I'm so passionate about this issue is simply because there's been a group of what I call uber wealthy folks in Utah and famous former politicians that are attempting to destroy what, in my opinion, is the last vestige of the original republic that the founders gave us. And that is our convention nominating system in the state of Utah. And I'm going to go into that a little more in detail here in just a few minutes, but let me just finish up with Thomas Jefferson's, a couple more comments of his in some letters that he sent out there. He said, every 100 should elect 1 or 2 jurors to serve where requisite. All other elections should be made in the hundreds separately, and the votes of those hundreds be brought together. You see, Thomas Jefferson believed that government should be local. And we should have a government, if you will, of every 100 families. And he called it the ward system. These little republics would be the main strength of the great one. We owe to them the vigor given to our revolution and its commencement. That's what Thomas Jefferson credited the revolution to in 1776. So this is, what, 50 years later? In the waning days of Thomas Jefferson's life, and he's wishing that they had implemented this at the local level. And, you know, I guess it should have been done at the state level, or they should have figured out a way to make sure it happened at the state level when they were in, because Thomas Jefferson was not in the Constitutional Convention. He was not part of that convention. He was the ambassador to France at the time and was not in the 1787 convention. Could I once see this, I should consider it as the dawn of salvation of the Republic. So see, to me, it's one of the reasons why I'm so passionate about this, is because this is rooted in the founders' doings, and I hope that we can preserve it. Divide every county in the nation, this is essentially, in simple terms, into 100-person family units with full self-governing powers in each unit. These units can then delegate some of their powers to the larger governmental bodies or not. So if this group of 100 chose, well, you know what, we'd rather just have the city, for example, do our policing citywide, then they could delegate their authority in that group of 100 for policing purposes or for whatever purposes they chose. That was the plan of Thomas Jefferson. The tiny size of these units would ensure that every person in the country knew his or her local representative, and as if you would, go knock on their door and complain right to their face. That's the purpose of having this kind of a small republic, if you will. Jefferson referred to this system as a system of wards. Now, coming to Utah's history, and the history of the state of Utah's, or the provisional state of Deseret, which is what the Mormon pioneers who landed here in 1847. In 1848, they made a petition to the Congress to create the provisional state of Deseret. And they operated in that until a couple of years later when the United States Congress changed it to a territory of Utah. And President Mallard Fillmore at that time made Brigham Young the governor of the territory of Utah. But one question you want to ask yourself is, why are LDS congregations called wards? Does anybody know? Claire, do you know the answer to that?
Yeah, they were meant to be cities, weren't they? And that was a city designation. It still is in Chicago. And
right, in Nauvoo, Illinois, in 1840 something, when they organized the city of Nauvoo, the Mormon pioneers, they organized that city into a geographic area essentially of 100 families. And they called it wards, and that was their congregations. I don't believe there's anything in Scripture that defines what a ward is, to my knowledge. But if you look under Wikipedia right now and ask that question, it comes up as, it's a political subdivision that was named in the Nauvoo era and moved to Utah. Okay? And
Also President,
essentially, it is, in fact, what became, in Utah's history, de facto political subdivision, but it was also religious subdivision, if you will. And there were essentially 100 families. And I believe that's what it pretty much is today in the LDS Church with our congregations, is about 100 families for the most part. It varies some from congregation to congregation, but for the most part, I believe it's about 100 families. Why are they organized essentially geographically in 100 families? I think it was because in the early days, I believe, Joseph Smith and Brigham Young in the Council of 50, who was charged with civil affairs in the LDS Church, understood what Jefferson did. That's my opinion. Now, I don't know that that's what it was. I've never read Joseph Smith's writings on it, or Brigham Young's, or the Council of 50s for that matter. But I think those men who understood some of the principles of liberty in the LDS Church understood that the governing power needs to be as close to the people as possible, and so they kept it within 100 families in the geographic area. Now, the process to elect civil authorities in both the provisional state of Deseret and the territory of Utah began with mass meetings, or wards, or voting precincts in the counties. They were divided, each county was divided into voting precincts, was essentially at that time kind of mirrored LDS wards. And that's changed over time, but that is what happened. Now, this is kind of interesting. During that period of early Utah history, there were two political parties that formed. There was a People's Party, who were pro-Latter-day Saint, and there was a Liberal Party, or anti-Latter-day Saint. And as you all know, this is kind of a Utah history lesson, maybe a little bit as well. In 1858, the presidency changed, and Brigham Young was taken and removed as the territorial governor, and Alfred Cummings, I believe, was the second territorial governor of the state of Utah. And he was appointed by, who was the president then? Claire, do you remember? I don't remember who the president was, but anyway, essentially, Brigham Young was deposed, if you will, by the President of the United States, and the President of the United States inserted his own governor in the state of Utah with no input from the people who lived here. And that was the way territories were governed. And that's one of the reasons that there were 5 attempts from 1848 to 1896 by the people of Utah to become a state. Because they wanted to have input on who their government leadership was. And it was difficult because there was a lot of angst amongst the rest of the nation, if you will, about some religious practices of Latter-day Saints, mainly polygamy. And that may have been some of the reason why, I think it was some of the reason why Utah did not become a state until 1896, and several other states around us did. Idaho, Nevada, Arizona, and Colorado. Several other states became states before Utah did. And I believe that was some of the reason behind that. The territorial federal appointees, they complained of the shadow government, or the ward system, and they disenfranchised women from voting in this territory. Now, isn't that interesting? The territorial government disenfranchised women. Utah became one of the first territories, states, if you will. When they finally reached statehood, they gave women the vote. That was the first state to do that.
I guess that's a pretty small offer.
As a condition of statehood, one of the attempts at statehood, the national political parties were forced on the people of Utah. And when that happened, they said, essentially the Congress said, look, if you want to have a constitution that we will approve, then you're going to have to adopt the national political parties in the state. And so what happened is Brigham Young went down the congregation and he said, you're going to be a Democrat and you're going to be a Republican. And you're going to be a Democrat and you're going to be a Republican. And so we got the two national parties instituted here in the 1880s. And that's that. Okay. After statehood, the people of Utah continue to nominate civil officers through what were called mass meetings as a matter of state law. The state legislature, after they became a state, they organized and they passed election codes where they continue to do this mass meeting thing where people show up essentially in the same kind of boundaries as LDS wards, only they weren't LDS wards, they were called voting precincts. Okay? That continued in Utah until 1838. Anybody know what happened in 1838?
1938.
Or excuse me, 1938, I'm sorry. 1938. Anybody know? This man right here, who knows him? Who knows who he is? This man is Herbert Maugh. And at the time, he was the president of the Utah Senate in the 1930s. And Herbert Ma wanted to become governor of the state of Utah. He was a Democrat, member of the Democratic Party, and his party refused to nominate him at their convention on 2 different election cycles. So during the 3rd election cycle, when he was up in the 1836 to 38, in 37 actually, he convinced his colleagues in the Utah legislature and the governor to change Utah's election system to a direct primary with a runoff. Isn't that interesting? This man wanted to get elected. And in 1838, he convinced them and he couldn't secure his nomination, so he pushed the Utah legislature to adopt a direct primary with a runoff. Then what happened is the direct primary with the runoff provision became so confusing to voters and expensive to candidates that it lowered voter participation. They got down to less than 10% people showing up to vote in primary elections during that time period. In 1947, the Utah legislature repeals the direct primary election with a runoff and reinstituted conventions and caucuses. And they did it in Utah election code. Okay? That stayed the same essentially until 1994 in the election code. And then it changed then because actually the legislature looked at some case law. The United States Supreme Court had changed, there were some cases that came forward that essentially eliminated the authority of states to regulate political parties, like Utah was doing at that time. And so to avoid the risk of having, litigation and so forth, the state legislature repealed all the election code, and essentially what happened in 1995, after that election code was repealed, is former Governor Mike Leavitt, of all people, shepherded the former code into Utah Republican Party's governing documents, the Constitution and bylaws of the Republican Party. And the Democratic Party did essentially the same thing. They codified into their own rules, if you will, how they were going to go about nominating people, and they kept essentially the same thing that was in the law before 1994. Because the Supreme Court is the reason that the Utah legislature made the decision to repeal it. Utah's election system pretty much stayed the same. There were some modifications that happened in the late 90s. There was a sitting congressman that lost the nomination of the Republican Party because of Democrats that were registering in the Republican Party, and the party then decided to close its primary election so that only Republicans could vote in it, instead of having Democrats cross over and vote in the Republican primary, because the Democrats believed that they had a weaker candidate they would put on the Republican primary, which essentially is what happened, and then that incumbent congressman lost in the primary, and as a result, they ended up, the Republican Party closed its primary election to only Republicans. And the state accommodated that in the 1994 law by allowing parties to, or asking the public, if you will, to register which party you want to affiliate with. Do you want to affiliate with one party or the other? That's a choice you have. Unfortunately, it's a public thing right now. If you affiliate with the Democrats, that's public. If you affiliate with the Republicans, that's also public. And some folks just don't want to disclose that. And unfortunately, we have in Utah now, this may sound a little strange to you, but the Republican Party in Utah is a minority of the of the electorate in Utah. And you say, well, how could that be? Well, the answer is because if you take all of the registered voters and you take just the Republicans, those who claim to affiliate with the Republican Party, that is a lower number than the balance of unaffiliated voters and Democrats and every other political party. So the Republican Party has a minority of the electorate in the state of Utah. Now you may say, well, that's kind of strange, but it's the truth. Okay? So, then in 2010, you all recognize this man, right? That would be Senator Robert Bennett, the late Senator Robert Bennett. He is denied a ballot position on the Republican convention in favor of Tim Bridgewater and Mike Lee. And they went on to a primary election that Bridgewater and Lee ended up winning. And of course, Senator Mike Lee is now in his second term in the United States Senate. But because this happened in 2010, there was a group of politicians, former politicians and wealthy people that just simply did not like the idea that this convention, these delegates that go to these conventions, have the authority to keep a three-term senator that's seeking a fourth term from receiving a Republican nomination. So then they started establishing politicians of both major parties, because it was both major parties. They're in shock that Bennett would be denied a ballot position on the Republican primary ballot, and they immediately begin efforts to destroy Utah's convention system of nominating candidates. And they formed this group called Count My Vote. Who is Count My Vote? The only way to determine who Count My Vote is to follow the money. Now, there are, you know, they form these political interest groups and political action committees, and they name them, and it's hard sometimes to find out exactly what it is, but if you do digging, you can find it. Who funded the initial drive in 2014? And that happens to be public information at elections.utah.gov. It's a little tricky because you have to know who, the names of the entities that they're using to fund the initiative, but essentially, it's uber wealthy folks who wanted to destroy Utah's election system, and former politicians, and here they are. Former Governor Mike Leavitt, former presidential nominee Mitt Romney, LeVar Webb, who is a political consultant who works with Romney and Leavitt, the late John Huntsman Sr., which at the time, of course, he wasn't deceased, he was just passed away a couple weeks ago. John's a very interesting man. He's done a lot of philanthropy and around the state. He's a great man. But on this issue, I happen to disagree with what him and some of these other folks have done. And then former Norman Matheson and Norman Bangerter, former governor and widow of former Governor Scott Matheson. Orrin Hatch, Jim Matheson, Kurt Jowers, who is he is the former director of the Hinckley Institute of Politics at the University of Utah. And this is Rich McEwen, who is a Leavitt chief of staff when Leavitt was the governor. I think he worked with Governor Leavitt in Washington when Governor Leavitt was a cabinet secretary of Health and Human Services. And he's now a partner with Mike Leavitt in what's called Leavitt Partners. This is Lane Beatty. He is the head of the Salt Lake Chamber of Commerce. Deloy Hansen contributed $25,000 to this effort. He's our own Cache Valley uber wealthy man. Spencer Eccles is a former owner of First Security Bank, and I think still owns a bunch of stock in Wells Fargo. Gail Miller, the widow of the late car dealer Larry H. Miller. Count my vote. This group of politicians and wealthy business people have conspired, in my opinion, to destroy Utah's neighborhood election system. And unfortunately, they've almost succeeded. Keep My Voice is an effort to help change that. In 2014, the Utah legislature passed a controversial election law known as SB 54. How many of you have heard of SB 54? Yeah, raise your hand. Okay. SB 54 is a law that the state legislature passed in a compromise agreement with Count My Vote. In 2014, Count My Vote ran their petition. They claimed they were getting close to the number of signatures. No one really knows because they weren't ever verified. But it scared the legislature to the point, and I don't blame a lot of them, but a lot of them, they felt like they were saving the convention system by agreeing to do what Count My Vote wanted them to do, which is essentially create an alternate path around the convention so that any candidate, if they choose to, can just ignore the convention entirely. And essentially that's happened in Utah's politics. The law allows partisan candidates to ignore party rules and conventions and access a primary ballot without any vetting by the political parties, and it's done by the force of state law. Political parties have not agreed to this, at least the Republican Party hasn't, and I know the Constitution Party hasn't. In fact, they've sued over it. They've sued the state of Utah over this issue. March 10th, the governor signed this law into law, and the very same day, the late Senator Robert Bennett penned a op-ed in the Deseret News. And what he said in the Deseret News that day essentially was, this was a complete win by Count My Vote. In the future, politicians will just ignore the conventions. I believe that is in fact true. It's already happened in a congressional campaign down in Utah County, down in the CD3 special election this year. I don't know what's going to happen this year in this election cycle. I've heard that some of these folks with Count My Vote are trying to convince Governor Romney, who has been rumored as running for the U.S. Senate, to not even attend our convention. Now, whether that will happen or not, I don't know. I hope it doesn't. I hope that Governor Romney will, in fact, come to the convention and participate there and get the support of the party behind him, in addition to running through a primary. I think that's best if he does that, but we'll see what happens. Utah's legislature passed that law. I already went through that. Keep My Voice. I want to talk to you for a minute about Keep My Voice. What is the cost to taxpayers of this change that happened in 2014 versus what will happen if Keep My Voice's initiative goes into law? Because it's costly to run these primary elections, both for candidates and for the taxpayers of the state. So I ask, what is that cost? And the answer is, Keep My Voice's Freedom of Association initiative will save the state of Utah $1.25 million over a 10-year period. And in contrast to that, Count My Vote, if their initiative that they're running right now goes into law, which will require a runoff primary in certain circumstances, it will cost the taxpayers of Utah $16.7 million over that same period. So that's one cost, is to the taxpayers of the state. The other cost is to candidates. It's a huge cost to candidates to go through a primary election in every cycle. And, you know, the system that has been in place, which essentially will stay in place if Keep My Voice initiative becomes law, is it will revert back and save that taxpayer money, and it'll also save candidates in this situation where they don't go to a primary. And where they do go to a primary, at least they've been vetted, and you'll only have a couple of candidates, and you won't have to have this runoff primary that they're talking about and putting on. This is a letter that was given to the Count My Vote initiative on October 30th by the state of Utah, and it just backs up those numbers that I told you. If you want a copy of that, please get a hold of me after, and we'll get that to you. Or it's on Keep My Voice's website. This is the same type of a letter that was issued on February 2nd for Keep My Voice and their initiative, and it lays out what those numbers are that I just had up on the screen prior to those two letters. Now, the proposed law repeals SB 54. It preserves the signature path for candidates to access the general ballot. That's something that's pretty critical. The thing that most people don't realize is there was already a signature path to access a public ballot before Count My Vote ran their initiative and the legislature passed SB 54. To access a public ballot, even today, if you choose to, you can go get 300 signatures for any state office and 1,000 for any statewide office. So a state legislative office, Senate or House, you choose to get on the ballot, you can do that by go out and gathering 1,000 signatures for a statewide office, U.S. Senate or governor or any of those. Or if you want to run for the state legislature, 300 signatures gets you on the general ballot. Now that would be as an independent candidate, but my thinking is if you want to affiliate with a political party, you ought to at least be willing to comply with their rules and have some kind of compunction to support their platform. And that's what, in my opinion, SB 54 violates. Just in closing, ladies and gentlemen, I would like you to just think about what could you do to help this initiative. What you could do is you could donate by going to keepmyvoice.org. You could volunteer. You could sign the Keep My Voice petition, which will be available starting tomorrow. You will educate, you can educate your neighbors and circulate the Keep My Voice petition amongst them. And you could ask people to remove their name from the Count My Vote petition if they've already signed it. Because in my opinion, that initiative, along with SB 54, is a violation of a basic constitutional right. And I'm going to just finish up here by suggesting to you that Justice Scalia, the late Justice, Supreme Court Justice Antonin Scalia, he made this statement. It was in it's been quoted in 2 different Supreme Court cases with respect to election law, and that is that a political party has a fundamental First Amendment right to determine the methods that it uses in nominating its candidates for the public ballot. And that right is the freedom of association, freedom of assembly. You see, it's, in my opinion, a complete violation of that fundamental right to assemble as you choose. And it's the state of Utah dictating to a private entity, the political parties of this state, the methods they use in putting forward their standard bearers. What would you think if you belonged to, say, the Lions Club, and the state of Utah passed this law and said, the methods you folks are using to produce your public front, the people who you are putting forward as your leadership, if you will, we're going to dictate to you how that happens. Or a more salient example, what would happen if and I know this may be another violation of freedom of religion, but what would happen if the state said, you know what, LDS Church, your bishops are not chosen in a democratic way. We think that each congregation ought to vote on who your leadership is. Or, we don't like the way your Quorum of the 12 is chosen, so we ought to have a vote of all of the bishops. Or well, maybe the Quorum of the 70 votes to see who the Quorum of the 12 is. You see, that is a violation of both religious freedom and freedom of assembly, in my opinion. And this may not have any religious connotation, but it does have the same kind of connotation with respect to with respect to freedom of association. So with that, I'm going to close this comment period for myself and just ask if there's any questions about this petition or the competing one that you may want to ask. So, yes, go ahead.
Just a quick question. One of the people I called today had signed this Count My Vote petition against her better judgment. She knew the minute she did, she just had this bad feeling. How does she get her name off of it?
Okay, if you will go to keepmyvoice.org or send her to keepmyvoice.org, there is a form on there that she can fill out, and she'll have to send that, fill it out, print it out, send it into the county clerk.
Okay.
And that should be that. Any other questions or comments? Claire?
I haven't read the initiative, but does it basically undo the SB 54 language and restore things to the way they were prior to SB 54?
Essentially, it does a complete repeal of SB 54, and it has some flowery language in there about freedom of association.
Okay.
And essentially that's all it does. It doesn't touch the signature provisions of the general, getting on the general ballot, but essentially what it would do is restore us to the 1994 election law that was essentially obliterated in 2014.
It doesn't mandate convention.
No.
caucuses.
It's
up to the party, right?
Yeah, that's exactly right. If a political party chose to do signatures, they could do signatures. You know, the mechanism wouldn't be in the law, but quite frankly, I wouldn't be opposed to a compromise with the legislature. If they wanted to leave this mechanism in law to allow political parties to choose signature gathering as a method of nominating their candidates, I'm not opposed to that. I think that should be the party's choice, though. That shouldn't be the state of Utah's choice, in my opinion. So anyway, did you have any other questions or comments?
No, there is a signature path. There always was, and there still is now for unaffiliated candidates to bypass convention, bypass the primary. And that, do you know those figures? It's pretty low, isn't it? Isn't it
300 signatures to be run for the state legislature, either house, and it's 1,000 signatures for a statewide office.
What the Senate?
So Senator Bennett could have done that and been on the general election ballot with no problem.
He could have, but there is also provisions in Utah's election code that are called sore loser laws. So once you file and to run in a political party, and if you lose in their convention or in their primary or whatever, you cannot then go become an independent candidate.
But he could have done.
But he could have done that. He could have chose at the very beginning, before he filed as a Republican candidate in March of 2010, to just, okay, I'm going to bypass the party. In fact, Senator Joe Lieberman did that very thing in the state of Connecticut. He avoided the Democratic Party's process and just ran as an independent candidate and got elected. Same thing happened in the state of Alaska. Lisa Markowski lost the primary election in the state of Alaska And they didn't have sore loser laws in the state of Alaska. And Lisa decided to run as an independent candidate after she lost in the Republican Party primary. And she won in the general ballot. Now, would Senator Bennett have won? I don't know.
Well, some background on that, because the TARP vote had come up just prior to that, and people were really angry about the way Senator Bennett voted on that TARP bill, which was part of, it was a banking law, a bank bailout. Was basically
Right,
what
it was. There were things that Senator Bennett voted on in
Well,
the
that was
couple of years of his term in 2000, between 2008 and 2010 that I think most, at least political activists in Utah, and I don't know how the general population felt. I mean, there's polls that say he would have had, you know, would have won or whatever. I don't know. But
that was the straw.
the people of Utah, even some state legislators that I am quite familiar with, who had meetings with Senator Bennett, said that he made comments in meetings with state legislators, said, you know what, the U.S. Constitution is in the way of what I need to get done in Washington. And that was offensive to the legislators because, you know what, most Utah people who are at least prescribed to Latter-day Saint philosophy, they are taught, and I believe this is true to a large extent, in fact I believe it is true, that the U.S. Constitution was inspired by God. Those men who gave us that gave us principles of liberty that were in fact come from deity. That's my opinion. Some people don't agree with that, but that's my opinion. So, Joe, did you have a comment?
Senator Bennett at convention even admitted in front of the delegation that he had cast, in his words, some toxic votes. And he knew that that cost him some points politically. And he said again in his words, if he had to cast those votes over again, he would still do it the same way.
And had Hatch been up for re-election at the same time, it would have happened to him too.
It could have. He would have been held accountable
But you know,
to the people who
part about
elected him.
Utah's election system is there is no one group that controls it. The thing that most people don't realize about the convention system, and I've seen this happen at almost every convention I've gone to. You might agree or disagree with this, Claire, but I've seen the chair of the convention stand up and ask the people, how many of you here are here for the first time? And it's usually about 70+% of the crowd is there for the first time. They've never been to a convention before. And there's 4,000 delegates that come to these statewide conventions. And of course we have county conventions too in every county, and delegates that are elected to go to those. And there's tens of thousands of delegates that are elected across this state to go to these county conventions and nominate both legislators and county officials. And quite frankly, I think it's a great system. And I don't know why we've abandoned it. We seem to have just decided to abandon it.
That's where one of the talking points comes from with Count My Vote, is they're claiming it's this exclusive club of Republicans that are making all the, you know, all the.
Well, and it really is not.
And it isn't. That's
2 years
what
after
happened.
Senator Bennett lost that election in 2012, when Senator Orrin Hatch was up for re-election for a 6th term, he spent $5 million to get through the convention. And he had 30 full-time employees doing nothing but identifying delegates in every precinct and doing robocalls and identifying those who were opposed to him. And he found that he got enough delegates, they all got elected. But even with that, all of that effort, once those delegates got in their position and started studying Senator Hatch's record, Senator Hatch could not convince 40% of them that he should have the nomination without a primary election. So they went to a primary election. That also didn't. Well, this group, I'm going to call them elitists, if you will, the folks who push and count my vote. That didn't make them very happy either, because Senator Hatch then had to spend another $5 million getting through that primary and the general election. So it cost Senator Hatch $10 million to get reelected in 12. And, you know, of course, he's sticking with his promise this time and not running again for 2018. We'll see. Yes?
Can you talk about the effect on the majority vote of the way it used to be? We had a majority vote at convention, we had a majority vote at primary compared to
Right.
what we would end up with.
Right. The SB 54 law has, in my opinion, a kind of a fatal flaw to it. Well, two fatal flaws when they passed it. One was they didn't allow political parties to close their primary to only their members. The Republican Party sued, and so did the Constitution Party over that. And the Republican Party, unfortunately, their summary judgment motion was summarily dismissed because of the attorney's late filings. And the Constitution Party's attorneys, they were successful at getting a decision out of the federal court that said that the state, you cannot do this. You cannot force people who are not members of the party into this primary election process. And so that was one win in the courts that the press never talks about, that we actually, well, the Republican Party was involved. They just didn't have a motion before the court because of a late filing on the part of the attorney that was representing the party. But nevertheless, it was ruled that the state can't do that. So that's one win that no one ever talks about, actually. The press doesn't ever talk about it. You know, you lost all these cases. That's one big win, actually, in my opinion. The other fatal flaw that this SB 54 law has, in my opinion, is what Claire is referring to as the plurality provision. So anybody can get on the ballot with a signature gathering effort. The Republican Party, at least, and I think the Democratic Party, still limits the number of people that come out of the convention to 2. But if someone gathers signatures, that means you could have 6 or 8 or 10 people on the ballot. Now, I know in CD3, special election to replace Jason Chaffetz this year, there was a candidate that did not go to the convention, you just gathered signatures, and that's Tanner Haynes. And so that meant 3 people were on the primary ballot for that congressional special congressional election, and it split the vote, so no one got a majority. The guy who won the plurality was John Curtis, and he is a former Democratic chair of the Democratic Party in Utah County. He's supposedly changed his colors to be a Republican now, but anyway, that happened.
So what he said in his words is, I may have changed my party, but I never changed my principles.
Okay, so he affiliated with the Republican Party,
Because
but he
that's
still
the
has
only
Democratic
way.
principles.
Yeah.
So in any event, this CD3 election is just it's a fulfillment of the prophecy, in my opinion, of Senator Bennett. We had a candidate just ignored the convention, got on the ballot, and it split the vote. And so the fatal flaws, in my opinion. Now, this new petition to count my vote.
Well, before you go into that, so
Yes.
in CD3, we had 3 candidates running as Republicans on
Yes.
the Republican primary, one of which was the convention winner, and the other 2 were not. One of them was a convention loser, and one of them was a convention skirter.
Right.
Didn't go through it. So what percentage of the votes did Curtis ultimately get at the primary?
I believe it was 41 or 42%.
Okay, so we had roughly 60% of the people who said, we don't want this person to be the Republican candidate.
Right, but the way the law is written, those who get the highest votes in the primary, no matter what percentage they get, are going to be the party's nominee against the will of the party. Would you agree with that, Claire? It's against the will of the party if
According to
you...
the party's rules, you should go to convention.
Right, and so, in any event, this is a violation of freedom of association, in my opinion. If you want to be representing the Republican Party platform and the Republican Party on the ballot, you ought to at least abide by the Republican Party's rules, in my opinion. So, any other comments or questions? Okay? Chris?
Does anyone in here know what count my vote, what their little petition looks like?
Well, I'm familiar with what some of the provisions of their,
No, I
the
mean,
new...
like, when they come around asking you for a signature, like.
They have not come to my door, so I don't know what their petition actually looks like. It is a uniform thing, though, that the state of Utah requires you to have it a uniform,
format.
if you will, format for the petition. And so you can get like, I think 25 pages, or 25 signatures per packet or something, and anyway, it'll be similar, it'll look similar to what the Keep My Voice petition will be. Okay? Because it's a uniform form that the state elections office requires that you circulate.
Does it happen to say Direct Primary Election Act on the bottom of it?
Yes, that's exactly what that is.
I have a picture of it, I know what it looks like.
Okay.
So I could send it out, but.
This one is going to say Freedom of Association Initiative. So that's the reality. Any other questions or comments? Okay, I'm going to declare this public hearing closed then. And if anyone wants to stick around for a minute, I do have some comments that you can listen to from some judges in the appellate case that is currently on the, going on in Denver, Colorado. So if you want to shut the videos off, you can do that now. But if you want to stick around for a minute, I can play those for you.